Good day, everyone. I'm Rose Galvez, and together with my partner Christela, we will tackle The Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus. The Myth of Sisyphus is a 1942 philosophical essay by Albert Camus, influenced by philosophers such as Kierkegaard, Arthur Schopenhauer, and Friedrich Nietzsche. Camus introduces his philosophy of the absurd.
Albert Camus' 1913 to 1960 gives us a quite different account of philosophy and politics of existentialism from that of Sartre. Perhaps the most striking difference from Sartre is his conception of the absurd. For Sartre, absurdity belongs to the word prior to the activity of consciousness, while Camus' idea of the absurd is closer to Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. The absurd is direct consequences of the absence of God. According to him, without God, the discrepancy between human aspiration and the world is acute. The human condition is characterized by the probability of suffering and the certainty of death, a fate which a human reason cannot accept as reasonable. In the face of this absurdity, the universal reason of the Enlightenment has nothing to say. In the Myth of Sisyphus, Camus elucidates this concept of the absurd. The absurd comes with the realization that the world is not rational. At this point of his effort, man stands face to face without the irrational. He feels within him his longing for happiness and for reason. The absurd is born of his confrontation between the human need and the unreasonable silence of the world. This confrontation is epitomized in the plague 1947 in the painful death of a child. The arbitrariness of the plague parallels to the absurdity of existence. The absurdity of existence raises the question of suicide and the meaning of life, thus it becomes the only true serious philosophical problem. Lucidity is the clarity and courage of mind which refuses all comforting illusion and self-deception. Lucidity is Camus' notion comparable to Kierkegaard or Sartre's anguish, but in the end, Camus is more positive than either Kierkegaard and Sartre. Camus concludes that one must imagine Sisyphus happy. Camus draws the political moral from his confrontation with the absurd in The Rebel 1951, which is an ethic of uncompromising honesty and lucid revolt against absurdity. There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. On the other hand, Camus sees many people die because they judge that life is not worth living. He sees others paradoxically getting killed for the ideas or illusions that give them a reason for living. He therefore concludes that the meaning of life is the most urgent of questions. Does the absurd dictate death? For Camus, this problem must be given priority over others. Outside all methods of thought and all exercises of the disinterested mind, shades of meaning, contradictions, and psychology that an objective mind can always introduce into all problems have no place in this pursuit and this passion. It calls simply for an adjust, in the other words, logical thought. That is not easy. It is always easy to be logical. It is almost impossible to be logical to the bitter end. Men who died by their own hands consequently follow to its conclusion their emotional inclination. Like great works, the feelings always mean more than they are conscious of saying. The regularity of an impulse or a repulsion in a soul is encountered again in habits of doing or thinking, is reproduced in consequences of which the soul itself knows nothing. Great feelings takes with them their own universe, splendid or abject. They light up with their passion an exclusive world in which they recognize their climate. There is a universe for jealousy, of ambition, of selfishness, or a generosity. At any street corner, the feeling of absurdity can strike any man in the face. As it is, in its distressing nudity, in its light without effulgence, It is elusive. According to Camus, from the moment absurdity is recognized, it becomes a passion, the most harrowing of all. But whether or not one can live with one's passion, whether or not one can accept their law, which is to burn the heart they simultaneously exalt, it stands at the center of this experience. There will be time to come back to it. Heidegger considered the human condition coldly and announced that existence is humiliated. The only reality is anxiety in the whole chain of beings. To the man lost in the world and its diversion, this anxiety is a brief fleeting fear. But if that fear becomes conscious of itself, it becomes anguish, the perpetual climate of the lucid man, in whom existence is concentrated. Heidegger concludes that the world can no longer offer anything to the man filled with anguish. This anxiety seems to him so much more important than all the categories in the world that make he thinks and talks of it. Karl Jasper despairs of any ontology because he claims that we have lost naivete. He knows that we can achieve nothing that will transcend the fatal game of appearance. He knows that at the end of the mind is a failure.
Mystical thoughts has familiarized us with such devices. They are just as legitimate as any attitude of mind. Without judging the value of attitude, Camus considers whether it is worthy of the conflict that concerns him. He reflects on one of Chekhov's remark, "The only true solution is precisely where human judgment sees no solution. Otherwise, what need would we have of God? We turn toward God only to obtain the impossible. As for the possible, men suffice." In his failure, says Kierkegaard, the believer finds his triumph. From the previous up to this part, Camus discussed how contrasting Shestov and Kierkegaard's writings are. He said that Shestov somehow believed that there is God, but a God full of hatred and is hateful, and that we must rely on him even we can see nor feel him, which is in contrast of how Kierkegaard gives the irrational the appearance and God the attributes of the absurd. In here, Camus said that thinking is learning all over again how to see, directing one's consciousness, and making of every image a privileged place. In other words, phenomenology declines to explain the world. It wants to be merely a description of actual experience. It confirms absurd thought in its initial assertion that there is no truth but merely truths. For methods of thought, in this case as elsewhere, always assume two aspects, one psychological and the other metaphysical. Thereby, they harbor two truths. Husserl exclaims that if all masses subject to attraction were to disappear, the law of attraction would not be destroyed, but would simply remain without any possible application. Camus knows that he is faced with the metaphysic of consolation. From the abstract God of Husserl to the dazzling God of Kierkegaard, the distance is not so great, but even though that's the case, the abstract philosopher and the religious philosopher start out from the same disorder and support each other in the same anxiety. It is always wrongly thought that the notion of reason is a one-way notion. To tell the truth, however rigorous it may be in its ambition, the concept is nonetheless just as stable as others. Since Plotinus, who was the first to reconcile the notion of reason with the eternal climate, it has learned to turn away from the most cherished of its principles, which is contradiction, in order to integrate into the strangest, the quite magic one of participation. It is an instrument of thought and not thought itself. Above all, a man's thought is his nostalgia. In the universe of Husserl, the world becomes clear and that longing for familiarity that man's heart harbors becomes useless. In Kierkegaard's Apocalypse, that desire for clarity must be given up if it wants to be satisfied. Absurd freedom, according to Camus, is what I know, what is certain, what I cannot deny, and what I cannot reject. This is what counts. The return to consciousness, the escape from everyday sleep, represents the first steps of absurd freedom. It is a matter of persisting. The absurd man only feels his irreparable innocence, which allows him anything. And it is with this that he is concerned. He wants to find out if it is possible to live without appeal. It was previously a question of finding out whether or not life had to have a meaning to be lived. It now becomes clear, on the contrary, that it will be lived all the better if it has no meaning. Living is keeping the absurd alive. Keeping it alive is above all contemplating it. Consciousness and revolt. These rejections are the contrary of renunciation. Everything that is indomitable and passionate in the human heart quickens them on the contrary with its own life. It is essential to die unreconciled and not of one's own free will. Suicide is a repudiation. Thinking of the future, establishing aims for oneself, having preferences, all this presupposes a belief of freedom, even if one occasionally ascertains that one doesn't feel it. But at that moment, I am well aware that the higher liberty, that freedom to be, which alone can serve as basis for truth, does not exist. Death is there as the only reality. After death, the chips are down. But at the same time, the absurd man realizes that he was bound to that postulate of freedom on the illusion of which he was living. In a certain sense, that hampered him. To the extent to which he was imagined the purpose to his life, he adapted himself to the demands of a purpose to be achieved and became the slave of his liberty. The notion of quantity has not been sufficiently explored, for it can account for a large share of human experience. Quantity sometimes constitutes quality. If I can believe the latest statements of scientific theory, all matter is constituted by centers of energy. Their greater or lesser quantity makes its specificity more or less remarkable. A billion ions and one ion differ not only in quantity but also in quality. It is easy to find an analogy in human experience. When Nietzsche writes, "It clearly seems that the chief thing in heaven and on earth is to obey at length and in a single direction. In the long run, there results something for which it is worth the trouble of living on this earth as, for example, virtue, art, music, the dance, reason, the mind, something that transfigures, something delicate, mad, or divine." He elucidates the rule of a really distinguished code of ethics, but he also points the way of the absurd man. Obeying the flame is both the easiest and the hardest thing to do. However, it is good for man to judge himself occasionally. He is alone in being able to do so. The Myth of Sisyphus. Sisyphus was the wisest and most prudent of mortals. According to another tradition, however, he was disposed to practice the profession of highwayman. To begin with, he is accused of a certain levity in regard to the gods. He stole their secrets. Aeina, the daughter of Aesopus, was carried off by Jupiter. The father was shocked by that disappearance and complained to Sisyphus. He, who knew of the abduction, offered to tell about it on condition that Aesopus would give water to the citadel of Corinth. To the celestial thunderbolts, he preferred the benediction of water. It is said that Sisyphus, being near to death, rashly wanted to test his wife's love. So, inutusan ni Sisyphus yung asawa niya para ilibing siya sa gitna ng plaza. And pagkatapos nun, nagising siya na nasa underworld, and after, parang nainis siya sa pagiging masunuri ng asawa niya and nanghingi siya ng permission kay Pluto para makabalik sa Earth. Na-amaze siya ulit sa ganda ng Earth and parang ayaw na niyang bumalik sa underworld, but after a few years, dumating si Mercury and binalik siya sa underworld where his rock was ready for him. They say myths are made for the imagination to breathe life into them. As for this myth, no one sees merely the whole effort of a body straining to raise the huge stone, to roll it, and push it up a slope 100 times over. One sees the face screwed up, the cheek tight against the stone, the shoulder basing the clay, covered mass, the foot wedging it, the fresh start with arms outstretched, the wholly human security of two earth-clotted hands. After pushing the stone several times, Sisyphus watches it rush down in a few moments toward that lower world, whence he will have to push it up again toward the summit. He goes back down to the plain. It is during that return, that pause, that Sisyphus interests me. A face that while so close to stones is already stone itself. I see that man going back down with a heavy yet measured step toward the torment of which he will never know the end. That hour like a breathing space which returns as surely as his suffering, that is the hour of consciousness. At each of those moments when he lives in the heights and gradually sinks toward the layers of the gods, he is superior to his fate. He is stronger than his rock. If this myth is tragic, this is because its hero is conscious. Sisyphus, proletarian of the gods, powerless and rebellious, knows the whole extent of his wretched condition. It is what he thinks of during his descent. The lucidity that was to constitute his torture at the same time crowns his victory. There is no fate that cannot be surmounted by scorn. And that is all for our report. Thank you for listening.